So in general, bioassays are a methodology that are used. They generally will take advantage of specificity of biological interactions in order to detect things. Could be for diagnostics or general detection of pathogens, et cetera. And the area that we work on are surface-based bioassays. And so these generally operate on any surface. This is a heterogeneous assay, and so we're detecting materials from solution to a surface. We put some type of molecular recognition molecule, or in this case proteins, on the surface, and we do a lot of work in just attaching biological molecules to surfaces that I'm not going to talk about. And this little cartoon here is that of an antibody, which demonstrates some of the most specific interactions that we know. And then there are some other details. You have to worry about blocking the surface from non-specific interactions. You only want this guy to govern all the interactions. And then once you prepared a chip, such as this, you would expose it to your solution of interest and detect your analyte or your antigen or your target, whatever you want to call it. And of course, this would be the target of interest. And so detection of this interaction is usually the big deal. And there's lots of different ways to doing that. And we're developing new ones. And so probably the most common type of assay is the ELISA, the Enzyme-Linked Immunosorbent assay. It's an antibody-based assay. Antibodies are immobilized on a solid phase. The little red guy here is the target, what we're trying to detect. Could be a diagnostic protein for cancer, or could be a bacteria, et cetera. Another antibody is then brought in for the detection, right? And so the first part is just capture of the target, and then you have to detect it. And in this case, another antibody is brought in with an enzyme. The enzyme reacts with some type of molecule that produces a color, and all this is done in 96 well microtiter plates, and the intensity of the color is related to how much of this initial analyte we have in solution. And so not only can proteins be detected, but they can also be quantitated. And so here's some data in terms of the money aspects of these types of things. In 2008, there were $22 billion spent just in these areas on so-called in vitro diagnostics, of which immunoassays comprised about 35%. And so you can do the math. It's about a little over $7 billion, which is not a giant market, but is still substantial. And people are predicting that emerging assays are going to fuel the further growth of these types of analyses. So what we are doing is developing metal particles that are conjugated to antibodies, metal nanoparticles that are conjugated to antibodies as the label. And so the experiment starts off with a layer of antibodies on the surface. You expose that again to your targets. That's these little green circles. The surface then captures your analyte or your target, and then you label it for detection. Okay, and so these are metal nanoparticles. What I'm going to talk about mostly today is gold. The only thing I'll talk about today is gold. And the size range is anywhere from 30 to 100 nanometers. So in that less than 100 nanometers scale that is considered nanoscience or nanotechnology. And we're developing a variety of ways to detect this. One method is simply through just a simple transmission visible spectroscopy to excite the electronic effects in metal nanoparticles. And so this surface would be glass, and we just shine light through that. We're using other techniques that are used for detecting biological interactions. And the one I'm going to talk about today is kind of a little bit more fancy technique called surface-enhanced Raman spectroscopy that is afforded by these small metal nanoparticles. Okay, so just to get everyone on the same page, because some of you may not be familiar with this technique, but what you need to know is kind of on this slide. It's a light scattering technique, Raman spectroscopy, that yields vibrational spectra. And so if you remember anything about analytical chemistry, you might have heard something about infrared spectroscopy that excites vibrations, and that's really what you're doing in this spectroscopy as well. It's considered a laser spectroscopy. It uses a laser, so a laser can be focused into a fairly small spot for smaller addresses. And then the important thing for our labels is that it was noted in the 70s that Raman intensities of molecules that are stuck or adsorbed to very small metal nanostructures, the signals are enhanced by up to 1,000,000 times. And this was dubbed surface enhanced Raman spectroscopy, and it's due to an enhancement of the electric field at the nanoparticle surface. It turns out that this is a true nano effect. This doesn't work for a big piece of gold. You have to have gold nanoparticles that are much smaller than the wavelength of light in order for this effect to take place. And so it is a true nano effect, although it wasn't developed in the age of nanotechnology. Again, this was first observed in the 70s. And single molecules have been detected by SIRS, which starts to get analytical chemists like myself thinking about using this type of technique for analyses, because as analytical chemists, we're always, well, at least some of us are always worried about or thinking about detecting things at lower and lower levels. Okay, at about 15 years ago, you couldn't do this experiment for less than maybe $250,000. Recently, instruments have come on the market where a shoebox size Raman spectrometer will cost you about $25K, so it's not the $80 that a microwave costs, but it's still a fairly low infrastructure for these types of assays. Okay, so here's a cartoon form of our label. We take a 30 nanometer gold nanoparticle and we modify it with molecules that can do two things. One thing is give us our Raman signal, and the other thing is to conjugate the protein, or in this case the antibody, to the metal surface. And so obviously all the work in this project is in this chemistry that I'm not going to talk too much about. I'm just going to show you some applications. And so some characteristics of these labels, and you can read them for yourself. The ones that I'll point out are the ones in red. Raman bands are narrow, and so if you have different molecules on different nanoparticles, you can detect them separately very easily, as opposed to a technique like fluorescence, which is a generally used technique for this type of analyses. Fluorescence bands are very broad, and you have to have very good optics in your instrumentation in order to detect lots of different fluorophores at once. The other thing that we like to take advantage of is that this whole nanoparticle, although it's very small, it's still much bigger than a molecule, and so there's about 15,000 labels on this single nanoparticle, and so we get very, very high signals in our detection. Okay, and so here's just a little bit of the chemistry for those of you that are interested in maybe organic chemistry. This, in most of the cases that I'll talk about, this is our linking chemistry, and this isn't drawn correctly. There's 15,000 of these molecules completely surrounding this gold nanoparticle. But the molecules have a sulfur group that binds very tightly to gold. It turns out our signal is going to come from this group. It's just nitrobenzene, a nitro group attached to a benzene. And this chemistry out here just serves to attach the protein to the nanoparticle. Okay, and we need this type of molecule to generate the signal, because if we just combine nanoparticles and proteins, we don't see anything. And so this is a Raman spectrum of this molecule, although it's taken for this whole system. Okay, and so you see these characteristic peaks, which are going to serve as our signal, and these peaks can be assigned to certain vibrations of this molecule, so it's very simple. Again, lots of reporters on a single molecule or a single particle, and we also have about 70 or 80 antibodies surrounding this nanoparticle as well. We want to do things in arrays because we want to detect many different interactions at once, and you heard about microfluidics a little bit earlier, and we use very simple microfluidics in order to pattern things on a surface. This isn't nano patterning. These addresses here are about 200 microns on a side, and so we use microfluidics to create these patterns. In fact, we've developed microfluidic devices to do spotting on larger scales, and this work was done by Eric Flame, who's sitting over here. So these are all microfluidic devices that allow you to put different addresses on on chips in order to measure massive amounts of interactions. And in this case, there's 96 spots here. And so you can do very massively parallel detection using these types of systems. This is kind of a bit of an aside.